In a world where money buys everything, a lost millionaire finds hope in the words of a street child. "I know how to make your son walk," she says, challenging not only medicine, but the very belief that the impossible can be achieved. In an upscale neighborhood of Athens, Greece, lives a man known for his countless fortune and luxurious lifestyle. He was the archetype of the modern millionaire: expensive clothes, luxury cars, and a business empire that seemed impossible to topple. His wealth was not only material, but also a source of power and influence. No one challenged him, and everyone saw him as a figure of respect, almost unattainable. But deep down, he carried a silent pain, something that most people were unaware of. His son, the product of a failed marriage, was born with a physical disability that prevented him from walking. Little Jason, with his curious eyes and infectious smile, spent his days sitting in a wheelchair, watching life pass him by. The father's pain was deep, but he never knew how to ease his son's suffering. He tried everything, hired the best doctors, but despite all the resources at his disposal, the miracle of seeing his son take his first steps never happened. On the other side of the city, in a completely different setting, lived Sofia, a street child. Left to her own devices, she survived on whatever she could find. Her frail body and dirty appearance reflected the harsh conditions of life on the streets of Athens. But there was something about her that was different. Her eyes had a rare depth, and her intelligence was something that surprised everyone who knew her. She was not just a street child. She had a wisdom that surpassed her age and social status. She understood people in a unique way, as if she could see right through them. One day, as the beggar girl wandered through the square, her hands outstretched for help, she noticed the millionaire man, his son, and the group of doctors who accompanied them. Something in her was awakened, an impulse, a sense of purpose for what she knew could help. Her mind did not dwell on the details of the poverty in which she lived, but focused on something much deeper. She knew something that the millionaire man did not. "Sir, I know how to make your son walk," Sofia said, with a confidence that not even the millionaire himself expected from a dirty, homeless child. The man looked at her with disdain, his gaze incredulous and skeptical, but also a spark of curiosity. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The doctor next to him made a disapproving gesture, but the millionaire didn't hear them. Something about that child, something in her eyes, made him consider the possibility, however absurd it was. Sofia, sensing the man's distrust, moved a little closer. She knew he wouldn't believe her without proof, without an action to validate his words. She had something very powerful inside her, an understanding that no one else, not even the best doctors, had been able to achieve. But for her, everything was as clear as day. She knew that the cure didn't lie in medicine, but in the strength of the mind, in the belief that one can have in the impossible. The moment was tense. Sofia looked at the boy in the wheelchair, and without hesitation, approached him. His father watched, and the crowd that had gathered around them waited to see what would happen next. None of those present understood what she would do, or how she could change something that seemed impossible to cure. Sofia, despite her dirty appearance and frail body, had an unbreakable spirit. She was no ordinary child. Although she had grown up in a world of poverty, her mind was sharp, and her eyes absorbed everything around her. Suffering had made her stronger, more observant, more capable of noticing the small details of life that others missed. She had no formal education, but she had a wisdom that no one could teach her. The street, with all its challenges, was her teacher, and she had learned to deal with adversity with astonishing ease. The fact that she was standing here, in front of the millionaire, was an irony of fate, a reminder that money, however powerful, could not buy a true understanding of human complexities. She had grown up in an orphanage that felt more like a prison. The staff were cruel, and the children were treated like disposable items. From an early age, she had learned to stand up for herself and to observe the world with a critical eye. The street, then, was a continuation of her learning. She had made unlikely friends, beggars, drug addicts, homeless people who somehow had more humanity than many of the rich and powerful she saw on the streets every day. Her ability to understand people, to penetrate the deepest layers of their feelings and intentions, made her someone who could perceive truths that others could not. And the millionaire named Dimitri was no different. Although his life was filled with wealth and comfort, he carried a silent pain, something that ostentation could not cover. His son Jason, the reason for his pain, was the legacy of a failed marriage with a woman who, before her death, had never given him the opportunity to get close to the boy. Dimitri felt lost in his inability to help his son, despite all the resources at his disposal. The pain of seeing his son confined to a wheelchair, unable to live the life he imagined for him, corroded his soul. He was deep down an empty man. Money and power could not fill the void he felt. Dimitri had spent years searching for meaning in his life, but nothing seemed to work. His son was his only reason to live, but paradoxically, he felt that his love for Jason was consuming him. He didn't know how to help his son, how to give him the freedom he craved, and it made him feel helpless. Despite all his wealth, he could not buy Jason's health. This emptiness consumed him, making him wonder if all his life of achievements really had any value. The moment Sofia approached, Dimitri felt something strange. His first reaction was skepticism. How could a street child with so little education and experience know more than the best doctors in the world? Yet something about her made him hesitate. Maybe it was Sofia's piercing gaze which seemed to understand more about him and his son than he did. Maybe it was the way she addressed him, with a confidence he had never seen in someone so young and vulnerable. Sofia was not just any beggar. She carried something about her that he could not understand, something that both attracted and disconcerted him. Sofia's gaze, though simple and direct, carried a wisdom that made him feel that perhaps she had the answer he had been searching for his entire life. She looked at his son, Jason, with a quiet intensity, as if she saw something beyond his physical disability, something that no one else could see. It was as if she saw the boy not as he was, but as he could be, and that was what made Dimitri change his stance. His initial anger gave way to curiosity. "If you really know what to do," he said, still suspicious but with a spark of hope in his eyes. "Show me." Sofia smiled, but in a way that was more mysterious than cheerful. She said nothing more, but her look meant everything. She knew that the cure would not come from conventional methods but from something she carried inside herself, something that could not be bought or taught, something that existed beyond the tangible, the palpable. The beggar child was not just any child. She was the key to something bigger, something Dimitri did not yet understand. In the days that followed Sofia's mysterious words, Dimitri couldn't stop thinking about her. How could a simple street child have approached him, a man of so much power and resources, with such an audacious proposal? He had heard everything over the years, from the best doctors in the world to promises of miraculous cures. But none of these solutions had ever come to fruition. His thoughts were filled with a mixture of frustration, skepticism, and strangely a small spark of hope. Something inside him told him that Sofia knew something he didn't yet understand, but he needed proof. He wouldn't be a rational man if he fell for the words of some random child without any evidence that there was something concrete behind his promises. So he invited Sofia to the luxury apartment where he lived, isolated from the world, a fortress of wealth and solitude. Dimitri didn't know exactly what to expect, but something drove him to see how far this could go. The apartment was imposing, with views of the Aegean Sea. The luxurious surroundings contrasted with Sofia's simplicity, who, upon entering, seemed out of place among the expensive furniture and the works of art on the walls. But to her, none of this seemed impressive. She had learned to observe what really mattered in people, and not in things. The farce of luxury was something she was already very familiar with after all. She had been rejected by those who thought themselves superior, precisely because of what they possessed. Jason was in the center of the room, as usual, sitting in his wheelchair. His eyes were fixed on the horizon as if he was waiting for something to happen. He was only 10 years old, but he seemed to carry a sad wisdom in his eyes. Sofia looked at him with a calmness that surprised even Dimitri. She approached and, without saying a word, began to observe the boy's posture, his limited movements, and, above all, the energy he transmitted. Dimitri stood at a distance, nervous, waiting for some kind of miracle or trick. However, Sofia simply took Jason's hand and began to speak to him in a low voice, as if she were telling him a secret. Dimitri could not hear the words, but the tone of her voice seemed gentle and comforting, almost as if she were connecting with the boy in a deep and intimate way. "Do you believe you can walk, Jason?" Sofia asked, still holding his hand. The question wasn't about the boy's physical limitations, but about his inner beliefs, about the way he saw himself. Silence hung in the air, and Dimitri felt a chill run down his spine. He knew a child's mind was powerful, but he hadn't imagined it could be so relevant. Sofia wasn't asking the boy to walk instantly. She was asking him to believe he could. For her, everything started with the mind. Jason looked at her curiously, but didn't answer. He had never had anyone believe in him like that. Dimitri, on the other hand, watched everything with a mixture of disbelief and despair. He wanted to see results, he wanted to see something concrete, but what Sofia was doing seemed so intangible. Sofia stepped away from Jason a little, and, without looking directly at Dimitri, spoke again. "Your son is not your fortune, Dimitri. He is more than that. But he needs to believe in what he can do. You need to believe in it too." Dimitri didn't know what to say. Her words were hitting him in a way he couldn't explain. He had always believed he could buy anything, but now he was faced with something that all the money in the world couldn't buy: belief. That night, Dimitri made a decision. He knew he was risking everything, but something inside him wanted to believe that maybe Sofia could really help his son. He knew it was too late to change everything he had done so far, but he was willing to try something new. He gave Sofia full access to his son, asking her to guide him and, if possible, help him walk. What he didn't know was that this request would be the beginning of a journey that would change their lives forever. As Sofia began her task of guiding Jason on his journey of overcoming, a new dynamic began to unfold around Dimitri. Although he was focused on the healing process of his son, he could not help but notice the complications that were arising in his life. Complications that were not directly related to his wealth, but to the internal conflicts that arose from his own life story. Sofia, although she was the key to what Dimitri wanted most, was also creating cracks in his world. She was not just a street urchin. Her disconcerting presence was starting to take Dimitri out of his comfort zone, where everything seemed under control. She made him question his choices, his beliefs, and most importantly, his relationship with his son. He had always been distant from Jason, and had never known how to truly approach him. Now faced with a child who believed in the ability to transform, Dimitri was beginning to realize the flaws in his own behavior. His relationship with Jason had always been marked by guilt, a guilt he couldn't shake. When Dimitri's marriage had fallen apart, he had tried to fill the void with more work, more wealth, and more distractions, rather than confronting his own emotions. And in doing so, he had missed the chance to bond with his son. This regret weighed heavily on his mind, and Sofia seemed to challenge him to confront it. She wasn't afraid to point out his weaknesses, something none of his employees or friends dared to do. As Dimitri reflected on his life and the choices he had made, the outside world was also beginning to present new challenges. His fortune, which he considered the pillar of his existence, was being threatened by an impending economic crisis. The market was falling and his companies were losing value by the day. Tensions were mounting, and he knew that he would soon have to make difficult decisions that could affect the future of his family. This placed him in an even greater internal dilemma. Did he really want to save his son, or was he more concerned about what he might lose if his fortune were destroyed? But the biggest complication was not his finances, nor his interactions with society. It was his relationship with Sofia. The girl was not influenced by the grandeur of his home, by the wealth he flaunted. She seemed to see beyond that, beyond the facade, beyond the expensive clothes and the imposing architecture. She saw Dimitri for who he really was, and he feared that this would unmask him in a way he was not prepared to deal with. Sofia, on the other hand, had her own internal conflicts. Although she had the power to guide Jason in his healing, she carried deep traumas from her childhood. Growing up on the streets had forced her to develop a pragmatic and distrustful view of the world. For her, trusting people was almost unthinkable. The pain of having been abandoned by her parents, of being ignored by society, made her resistant and often aggressive in her interactions. However, with Jason it was different. She saw in him a purity that she herself did not have, an innocence that made her want to fight for him in a visceral way. But there was something about Sofia that kept her from giving herself completely to this cause. She knew that helping Jason would require more than her own mental strength. She needed a kind of trust that she wasn't sure she could give. After all, what would happen if she failed? What would happen if, in the process of trying to save the boy, she lost herself? These questions plagued her, but she couldn't let fear paralyze her. She had a mission, and her instincts told her that it was beyond her ability to fail. The tension between Sofia and Dimitri was also starting to mount. Although he began to see value in what she was saying, he still doubted her ability to truly help his son. He knew that if she failed, he would lose his last chance to get his son on his feet. This fear began to shape his interactions with her. He was not only placing his son in her care, but also his own redemption. The pressure was on, and this dynamic of power and distrust was reflected in the small actions between the two. Meanwhile, the external crisis in Dimitri's finances was intensifying, creating a real storm in his life. He knew he needed a solution, and quickly. But at the same time, his attention was divided between trying to save the company and doing whatever was necessary to ensure his son had a chance at a better life. The pressure was reaching an unbearable point for Dimitri. His business was sinking. His finances were in ruins, and at the same time, he saw his personal life unraveling before his eyes. What tormented him most was that, despite all his wealth and power, he could not offer his son something as simple as the freedom to walk. He was watching everything crumble: his relationships, his business, and most importantly, his own hope of finding peace. But there was one last possibility, something that he thought could be the solution. He gave himself completely to what Sofia was saying, believing that his only chance of salvation lay in her. Sofia, on the other hand, was at her breaking point. She felt the pressure building on herself. Though she believed deeply in healing, her own history of pain and loss made her question her ability to change Jason's life. She wanted so badly to believe that she could change the boy's fate, but doubt was beginning to eat away at her confidence. And with every step she took, there were more obstacles. Every conversation with Dimitri made her realize how lost he was, how desperate he was for something to be done for his son. He depended on her in a way that frightened her. She, a simple beggar, was now at the center of a hope that seemed too great to bear. And then, something unexpected happened. One morning, Dimitri sat in his living room, staring at the numbers of his business crumbling before him. The phone rang, and when he answered, his lawyer's voice delivered devastating news. He was being sued for financial fraud at his companies. The stock market crash had alerted authorities to suspicious activity, and now Dimitri found himself facing an investigation that could destroy everything he had built throughout his life. The financial crisis he had been trying to avoid was now right there, at his doorstep. Without time to digest the news, Dimitri looked to the side and saw Sofia talking to Jason. With her calm, almost maternal manner, he watched her from afar, a strange mix of frustration and admiration taking over his mind. But at that moment, he felt as if his life was being completely undone with nothing to hold on to. He wanted to give himself completely to what Sofia proposed, but now his mind was full of uncertainties. He didn't know what to do, and that fear, the fear of losing everything, became almost unbearable. Sofia, on the other hand, had made a decision. She knew that in order to help Jason, she needed him to believe not only that he could walk, but that he could live a life free from limitations. She looked at him firmly, asking him once more to imagine that he was standing, walking. "You have the power within you, Jason," she said. "You don't need anything more than to believe." It was at that moment that something strange happened. A different energy seemed to hover in the air. Jason, with a distant look in his eyes, seemed immersed in his own emotions, as if he were listening to something that no one else could hear. Sofia, in her heart, felt that something was changing. She believed that Jason's mind could be the key to what he needed, but even she was unsure. She didn't know if he could actually walk, but she knew that he needed more than just being able to physically take those first steps. He needed to believe that he could live a life without the constraints of his disability. Dimitri then approached, not knowing what to say. He had heard Sofia's words, but something inside him made him feel guilty. As much as he was willing to help his son, he knew that his inability to love and connect with Jason up until that point made him a true stranger in his own home. "Sofia, I don't know what to do now," Dimitri said, his voice cracking with anguish. "I'm losing everything, not just my son, but everything I've built." Sofia stared at him for a moment as if weighing his words. "You're afraid, Dimitri, and your fear is paralyzing you. It's not money or power or things that will heal your son. He needs you, and you need him." This confrontation between them was the real turning point. Dimitri began to realize that his biggest obstacle was not the financial crisis. It was not the lawsuit he was facing or his crumbling fortune. It was his inability to be vulnerable, to be a real father. While he tried to control everything around him, he had never allowed himself to be honest with his own son. From that moment on, Dimitri decided to put everything aside, his career, his empire, and focus on what really mattered, Jason. He knew he could lose everything, but if he didn't try now, he would lose his son forever. He knelt down beside Jason, took his hand, and with a shaky voice said, "I'll be here for you, and I'll try to be the father you need." Dimitri's decision to throw himself into his son's transformation wasn't without its consequences. As he began to focus more on Jason and Sofia's words, his personal and professional life began to crumble even faster than he could have imagined. The lawyers came with worse news every day, and the empire he had built, brick by brick, was beginning to disintegrate. His company's stocks fell further, and rumors about his financial investigations spread, fueling the crisis he had been trying to avoid. But somehow, he no longer cared so much about that. What had once been his biggest concern now seemed secondary to his growing connection with his son. Sofia, in turn, felt the tension increase as the days went by. She knew her mission was far from easy. Jason's healing was not something that could be achieved with a simple touch or a trick of words. She had begun to realize that true transformation required more than a child's belief. It also required concrete action, a profound internal change. She needed Dimitri's support, but he was so focused on his own financial problems that his mind was often far away. However, there were times when Sofia saw a slight change in Jason. On quieter days, she could see a new sparkle in his eyes, a lightness in the way he looked at the world. He was beginning to understand that his disability did not define who he was. Sofia urged him to use his mind and see himself walking, not as a child confined to a wheelchair, but as someone with the power to overcome any obstacle. But the external crisis was relentless. Dimitri was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the pressure of dealing with the collapse of his empire. He had distanced himself from business for days, focusing entirely on his son and Sofia. But now, as the consequences became more tangible, he knew he had to make a difficult choice: continue to believe that change was possible, or return to his old life and try to save his fortune. Doubt consumed him, and the anger at his own helplessness grew with each passing minute. Meanwhile, the reactions of those around Dimitri only made matters worse. His co-workers began to pressure him to take drastic measures to save his companies. Friends and family who had once praised him for his wealth and power now distanced themselves, suspicious of his ability to manage everything. The people he used to associate with began to distance themselves from him, as if his downfall were a final sentence. The millionaire was beginning to see what it meant to be truly alone, something he had never experienced before. Sofia, with her keen insight and understanding of people, could not help but see Dimitri's struggle. He had become, in her eyes, more human, more vulnerable. But she also knew that his inner struggle, his fear of losing everything, was preventing him from acting more decisively. For Sofia, Jason's healing was intertwined with Dimitri's emotional healing, but he could not free himself from his own ego and the need to control everything around him. That was when Sofia realized something crucial. She understood that in order to help Jason, it wasn't enough to make him believe he could walk. She also needed to help Dimitri free himself from the weight of his own arrogance and fear of failure. He was so trapped in a life that no longer served him, so overwhelmed by the pressures of the outside world, that he couldn't see the possibilities before him. Only when he allowed himself to live without the burden of money and power would he be able to create real change. Jason's transformation process began to intensify. He began to practice the exercises suggested by Sofia, trying to imagine himself standing, trying to believe in what seemed impossible. Though the results were not yet visible, there was a palpable feeling in the air, an energy of change that Sofia and Dimitri could feel, but neither of them could explain. But the pressure from outside continued to mount. Dimitri, despite his desire to focus on his son, felt increasingly pressured by circumstances. His business was on the verge of collapse, and the prospect of losing everything seemed increasingly real. He knew that time was running out, and that he had to act. But would he act to save his fortune, or to save his relationship with his son? The tension between what Dimitri wanted and what he really needed to achieve was reaching its peak. The weight of his collapsing financial empire and the external pressures on his life were tearing him apart. The constant calls from lawyers, the reports of falling stock prices, the distrust of his former allies, All of it was pushing him deeper and deeper into an abyss of anguish. But no matter how hard he tried to distance himself from the external chaos and focus on his son, Dimitri couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control of everything. It was in that moment of near despair that he realized something vital. True change came not from what he had, but from what he was willing to let go of. Dimitri realized that he had lived his entire life trying to control the uncontrollable, clinging to power and wealth as a form of protection against his own vulnerabilities. He knew, in that moment, that if he wanted to truly change his son's destiny, he had to let go of his own fears and insecurities. He had to stop worrying so much about perfection and maintaining a facade. It was a gradual but fundamental process. He began to open up to Sofia and what she truly represented. Not just a street kid, but someone who somehow understood the complexities of life in a way he never had. She offered him something none of his businesses or riches could, the chance to truly live authentically. Dimitri began to realize that his son did not need a father who was perfect or invulnerable. Jason needed a father who was genuine, who saw him for who he really was, and who loved him without reservation. With that, Dimitri took the first step towards true transformation. He began to actively participate in the exercises with Jason, helping him believe that he could indeed take his first steps. Although the results were not immediate, there was a visible change in their relationship. The confidence that had previously seemed absent began to slowly blossom. Dimitri was becoming the father Jason needed, and Jason in turn was beginning to believe in himself in a way he never had before. Sofia watched this all with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation. While she had helped unlock Dimitri and Jason's potential, she knew that the biggest obstacle was still the faith they both needed to have, not just in each other, but in themselves. But there was something deeper going on. Their connection was growing stronger, and she knew that was what really mattered. The most important thing wasn't whether or not Jason would be able to walk, but that for the first time he was seeing himself not as someone with limitations, but as someone with infinite possibilities. It was a cold morning, and Dimitri was with Jason again, this time in the mansion's garden. Sofia was present, watching from afar. Dimitri, his hands shaking, held Jason's hands and spoke to him with a sincerity that was new, not only to his son but to himself as well. "I don't know what's going to happen, Jason, but what I do know is that I'm here, and I'm going to fight by your side. Not because I'm afraid of losing, but because I know now that you deserve something better than I ever knew how to offer. Let's go together, son." Jason looked up at his father, his small face illuminated by the soft morning light. He didn't say a word, but his eyes shone with a new determination, a spark that had seemed impossible to achieve before. He tried to stand with Dimitri's help, his legs still weak, but his muscles, so neglected over the years, were now beginning to respond. It wasn't an instant miracle, but it was the beginning of something profound, something that all three of them knew would change their lives. Sofia approached, her expression calm, but her eyes shining with the satisfaction of knowing that she was, in some way, helping to create a new beginning for all of them. She approached Dimitri, and with a soft smile said, "Did you see? The first step was not physical, Dimitri. The first step was emotional. The rest will come." Dimitri, still holding Jason's hand, looked at Sofia. "I didn't know, Sofia. I didn't know how much I was losing myself until now." She just nodded. "We were all lost somehow, Dimitri, but now we can all find each other." Jason finally took another step, firmer this time, with his father's help. He looked at Sofia, and a shy smile appeared on his face. He hadn't said a word, but in that moment, he knew. He was no longer alone. He had the support of his father and Sofia, and more importantly, he was beginning to believe that he had the power to change his own destiny. Dimitri and Jason's interchange began to show results, but they were still far from achieving true transformation. The environment around them, although calmer, still carried the tension of the economic crisis that threatened to destroy Dimitri's empire. However, the real test was about to happen. The fate of his son, the recovery of his life, and the relationship between him and Sofia now depended on one last step: confronting his greatest fears. Dimitri had begun to connect more with his son, but the journey was not without its obstacles. He knew that emotional change would not be enough to ensure that Jason could walk again. He needed to continue to be the father that Jason needed. But more than that, he needed to find a way to not get lost again in the world of power and wealth. There was one truth he was beginning to understand. He could no longer live for appearances. The pursuit of money and status could no longer be his priority. He needed to be more than that for Jason. He needed to be a role model, a solid foundation. With that, Dimitri made a decision. He would sell most of his possessions to start over, without the burden of his fortune. It would be a risky move, but he knew that his family's true freedom lay beyond gold and influence. He also knew that this decision could be the final push to save his relationship with Jason. His son didn't need wealth. He didn't need the material comforts that money could offer. What he needed was his father's unconditional love and genuine belief in his potential. While Dimitri struggled with this decision, Sofia was also dealing with her own internal conflicts. She knew that the biggest challenge was yet to come. Not only was it helping Jason physically walk, but also helping him believe that he was capable of living a life without the limitations society imposed on him. Sofia understood that if she were successful, it would not only change Jason's life, but it would also give Dimitri the chance to redeem his failures as a father. However, Sofia couldn't deny the fear she felt. She knew that in order to change Jason's life, she couldn't rely solely on her ability to connect with him emotionally. More was needed. She needed to help him overcome the trauma of his physical condition, but she also needed to deal with the emotional trauma she herself carried. The weight of her life story haunted her, and the fear of failure, of not being enough, was beginning to weigh heavily on her shoulders. While Dimitri and Sofia were engaged in their own internal struggles, something significant was beginning to happen to Jason. He was finally believing what Sofia had told him, that he was not defined by his physical condition, but by what he believed he could achieve. His daily workouts were beginning to show small improvements. Each step he took, no matter how unsteady, brought a growing sense of confidence. His mind, which had previously been stuck in a cycle of despair, was now opening to new possibilities. His relationship with his father was growing stronger every day, and together they were beginning to create something new, something that not even Dimitri's money could buy. Jason was starting to walk, and with it, the emotional weight of his entire life. The transition was slow and full of difficulties, but he was determined. Each movement felt like a challenge, but he knew he had the support of his father and Sofia. His confidence was growing in ways he never imagined possible. What had once seemed like a distant dream was becoming a tangible reality. Dimitri, for his part, could not help but notice the changes in his son. He saw Jason take his first real steps, hesitant and uncertain, but filled with a determination that Dimitri now recognized as something he himself lacked. The simple act of walking was no longer just a matter of mobility, but a symbol of something much deeper: Jason's emotional transformation and the renewal of the bond between father and son. Sofia watched from a distance with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew that Jason was still at the beginning of his journey of overcoming his problems, but he had already achieved something immeasurable. He believed in himself. To her, this was more important than any physical healing. She was seeing true transformation take place, not just in Jason, but in Dimitri as well. However, the external reality still loomed over them all. Dimitri's financial crisis was about to reach its peak. He was at a turning point in his life with difficult choices ahead of him. But as he watched his son take his first steps, he knew that the true testament of his life would not be measured by the numbers he had, but by what he was able to offer his son: love, dedication, and the chance to live a full life, free from the chains of the past. The sound of the phone ringing cut through the silence of the room, and Dimitri knew that the sound did not bode well. The investigation was coming to a close, and as much as he had stepped away from the business, the weight of the bad decisions he had made over the years was finally taking its toll. But right now, he couldn't focus on that. He couldn't let the problems outside affect the transformation that was happening inside his home. Jason stood up for the first time, holding his father's hand more firmly than he had ever imagined. His steps were slow, unsteady, but he was walking. Dimitri watched him, his eyes brimming with tears. He had watched his son, a boy who had once been a prisoner of his own condition, now begin to believe that he could achieve the impossible. Jason's journey, though difficult and full of obstacles, was far from a story of failure. It was a symbol of overcoming, and in that moment, he knew that nothing else mattered as much. The phone rang again, insistently. Dimitri, without thinking, ignored the call. He was experiencing something that surpassed any other material value. He was finally experiencing a true connection with his son. His mind, which had previously been concerned only with money and past failures, was now completely focused on the present. He felt his heart beating with a new rhythm, something he had never known before, the purity of true love, without the distractions of wealth or fame. Jason took a firmer step, and Dimitri's smile widened. It was as if the entire world had disappeared, and all that mattered was him and his son, finally free from all the constraints of the past. Sofia stood in the background, watching, a small smile on her face. She knew this moment was happening, but she didn't want to interfere. This wasn't about her. It was about them, and she had done her job. But the phone kept ringing, and deep down, Dimitri knew that time was running out. He had to make a choice that could change everything. The economic crisis was reaching its peak. He knew that if he didn't make a decision now, he would lose everything he had built. But now, he knew that nothing else mattered. What he had built was really nothing more than a facade. What really mattered was Jason's future, and he couldn't let his pursuit of wealth and status ruin that. When the phone rang again, Dimitri finally answered. The lawyer's voice, serious and impersonal, sounded distant. "Dimitri, the trial is coming to an end. We need to decide what to do. You are on the brink of irreversible bankruptcy. Your empire is in ruins. What do you want to do?" Dimitri looked at Jason, who was taking another step, now with more confidence. He then said, with a clarity that came from his final decision, "Sell everything. I don't want anything else. I already have what I need." The answer hung in the air for a moment, and the silence that followed was heavy. The decision had been made. Dimitri was giving himself over to what really mattered, the emotional and physical recovery of his son, the building of a true bond between father and son, without the weight of wealth that had always kept him from everything that truly meant anything. With Sofia by his side, he felt a peace he never imagined he would experience. It wasn't the peace that came from wealth or power, but the peace of knowing he was finally doing the right thing. He was embracing vulnerability, letting go of the need to control everything, and allowing his son to be free to live his life without limitations. Jason, with a smile on his face, took another step, this time more firmly. Dimitri, still holding his hand, looked at him with an expression of pure love. He knew that this was the true victory, not the financial recovery, but the transformation of his son and the rebirth of his own humanity. Sofia, watching this scene, felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had fulfilled her role, but she knew that without Dimitri's willingness to change, none of this would have been possible. She didn't want to be the center of attention. Her job was done, and now she could let Jason and Dimitri follow the path they had chosen. She knew that true healing for all of them came from within. The phone rang one last time, but Dimitri didn't answer. He didn't need it anymore. He looked at Sofia, smiling, and said, "Now let's see what the future holds together." The sun was slowly setting over the city of Athens, reflecting its warm colors in the waters of the Aegean Sea. Dimitri and Jason sat in the garden, contemplating the horizon with silent peace. There was no longer any rush, no longer any need to chase a future that seemed to be just an illusion of control. What had been lost over the years, the bond, the trust, and the genuine love was now being rebuilt step by step, with patience and vulnerability. Sofia, with her watchful and discreet gaze, watched from afar. She knew that her mission there had been accomplished. She had given Dimitri and Jason the tools they needed to begin the true transformation. But in the end, they were the ones who had done the hard work. She felt proud, but also aware that, in order to be complete, this change would need to come from within each of them. Jason was now walking with more confidence, but his journey was just beginning. It was not an end, but a new beginning, a new way of living and seeing himself in the world. Dimitri, with the experience of having lost everything to find something deeper, now saw life in a completely different way. He knew that the wealth he once had was nothing more than a facade. The real wealth was the connection he had rebuilt with his son. He no longer needed to seek the approval of the world. He had found his true identity in what truly mattered. When he looked at Jason, he felt a deep gratitude, as if he had finally been in the right place at the right time. "You're doing great, son," Dimitri said, a smile on his face. "I never thought I'd see this day, and I thank you for showing me that there's so much more to life than I ever imagined." Jason smiled back, now with a new confidence. He no longer needed what he had before, the material possessions or social status that his father had once believed he needed. He had something more valuable: faith in himself and the unconditional support of his father. Sofia, watching from afar, knew that the change she had begun was now taking its own course. The healing process was ongoing, but the most important part had already happened. She could no longer intervene. What she had provided was a window, a vision of possibilities beyond the pain, fear, and limitation. They had taken the first step into a new chapter. That night, as Dimitri and Jason talked and laughed together, with the orange horizon as their backdrop, the house seemed more full of life than ever. External pressure, bankruptcies, and financial loss no longer ruled their days. What ruled now was something much deeper: the love and trust that had been rebuilt in the midst of adversity. Dimitri knew that the future could still bring new challenges, but now he was more prepared to face them. He was no longer the man who tried to control everything around him. He was a father, willing to do whatever it took to ensure that his son had the chance to live a full life without limitations. And Jason, although he still had a lot to learn, was stronger, more resilient, and more in touch with himself than he ever imagined possible. Life now had renewed meaning for them. The path ahead was uncertain, but together they were ready for any challenge. A few years later, Dimitri's mansion, which once reflected the ostentation and pain of an empty life, was now a home of laughter and sincere conversations. Dimitri had walked away from the world of business and wealth, but the peace he found with Jason and Sofia was more valuable than any fortune. Jason, now more independent, walked without anyone's help, with a confident smile on his face, always accompanied by the watchful eye of his father. Sofia, who had become a close friend of the family, continued her journey, but she knew her role in this chapter was over. She had given Dimitri and Jason the tools to find themselves, and now she let them move forward with a light heart and an open future. If you are enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel, comment, and leave your like. Don't miss this story that is currently on the screen. I'm sure you will like it. See you in the next video.